Osama Bin Laden is dead, and here to give us his reaction, Professor Ward Thomas. And Professor, you've been with us before, and we appreciate your coming in again. Talk to us about just when you heard the news yesterday, what your reaction was as somebody who studies the security and looks at these things.
Well, actually, I didn't hear the news until this morning.
Yeah.
Getting on early to bed, early to rise, all that sort of thing. I mean, my first reaction was, as an American, I was happy. I thought that the failure to locate and either capture or kill Osama Bin Laden over what has now been almost 10 years has been a source of some national embarrassment, certainly some national discontent, and I think the symbolic significance of what happened yesterday is huge for Americans.
Picking up on that symbolic nature of it, if he had died of natural causes, in a way he probably would have beaten the United States. We wouldn't have gotten this final justice that we got the other day by this rate. But what would it have been viewed like in the Muslim world, and what is the fact that he was shot by Americans in this raid? How will that be perceived in the Muslim world?
Well, I think the concern is that among his supporters he'll be portrayed as a martyr, and there certainly will be some of that. I'm not sure, though, that that is going to translate into a greatly increased level of threat or danger for the United States and its allies.
Because those who wanted to do us harm already wanted to do us harm?
I think that's true, and I think that over the last 10 years, the United States' fortunes in what we've called the global war on terrorism have waxed and waned, but over that time, the ideology of al-Qaeda and the ideology of violent extremists in the Muslim world broadly has failed to catch fire, has failed to really grab hold of the hearts and minds of the population of these countries in very broad and meaningful ways. And I think that the most important reactions today and in the days ahead are not necessarily going to be those in American cities. I think they're going to be those in cities in the Middle East and the Arab world and the Islamic world more generally. And my guess is they're going to be relatively muted, not tremendously large. We'll see some for sure, but I think that the ideology of al-Qaeda has not attracted an awful lot of adherents in the Muslim world.
And Professor, you talked earlier about the symbolic nature of this. Now, we have cut off symbolically then the head of al-Qaeda, but was Osama bin Laden really running al-Qaeda? It seems as if it's been portrayed as if there could be lone wolves, as if there's a number. I mean, who was his courier that we tracked him through, really taking messages to?
That's a very good question, and some of it remains to be seen. Most people think that the al-Qaeda that Osama bin Laden remained in charge of was a relatively small, fragmented, and not terribly powerful organization. So the al-Qaeda that existed on September 10th, 2001 really was somewhat of a thing in the past. It had been decimated and weakened over the years. The other side of that coin, however, is that the ideology had spread, not to the masses, I think, not to the rank and file in much of the Islamic world, but certainly to other extremists who had other beefs with either their government or with the Western world. We saw in Iraq one of the most dangerous insurgencies during the war in Iraq from 2003 to about 2007, called itself al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was loosely affiliated with bin Laden's al-Qaeda, but it used the same name largely out of the desire to associate itself with the anti-Westernism and to attract adherents among devout Muslims. The foiled Christmas Day airliner bombing of December 2009 was the design of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen. Again, Osama bin Laden wasn't directly calling the shots for that organization.
Does this lend some credence then to the fact that maybe we should not be in Afghanistan, that we should be more of a mobile strike force? Where is al-Qaeda? If it's in Yemen, now we should be centered on there as opposed to being bogged down in wars, whether it's in Iraq, where we still have troops remaining, in Afghanistan.
Well, I think it's a question with a couple of different answers. I think that going forward on the military front, the sort of capabilities that we witnessed in the last 24 to 48 hours are going to be very important. Relatively low tech, relatively small numbers of forces operating with great courage and skill, and operating on the basis of intelligence that was gathered very patiently and diligently over a period of months and years. Those are the sorts of things that are likely to be very important, more so than hundreds of thousands of troops in large-scale battles with very expensive weaponry. I think, though, that the non-military side of the coin is going to be at least as important, and that is the public diplomacy, the so-called campaign for hearts and minds, trying to make sure that the United States is not perceived as an enemy to Muslims worldwide.
On the diplomacy side, though, Professor Thomas, here we have someone who I think many of us in our minds thought was hiding out in a cave, eating a hardtack, not able to use the phone, living without electricity. Instead, we find him in a city populated by retired Pakistani military officers in a mansion, as it has been described, that cost millions of dollars to build. What does that say about our supposed allies?
It's a great question, and a very difficult one with very troubling implications. I would say, first of all, it's too early to assume that his presence there should be ascribed to the knowledge of or accession of the Pakistani government per se. Pakistan is a tremendously complicated country. Its government is fragmented, and there's a large divide between the civilian elements of its government and the military elements of its government. And of course, a very powerful element in Pakistan is the Inter Services Intelligence Agency, the ISI, which has been suspected in the past of sympathy with Islamic extremists. Now, it's difficult to believe that no high-ranking elements of ISI had any knowledge of his whereabouts, but we also have to be cautious in assuming that that meant that there was a much, much wider-ranging body of knowledge among Pakistani government officials.
And what does it mean for our intelligence officials as well if it turns out that, that the name of the courier, which is how supposedly at this time it seems we tracked him, if that information was gotten through some extreme measures from a prisoner at Guantanamo Bay, does it then mean that waterboarding, other forms of what many people in America view as torture, those would be legitimate ways to get information?
Another very good question. I would say that in answering that sort of question, you have to balance the costs and the benefits. First of all, it might be impossible ever to ascertain exactly what information came from what sources under what conditions. But I think it's also important to understand that when those stories of the so-called heightened, enhanced interrogation techniques were made public, along with things like the scandal at the Abu Ghraib prison, the damage done to United States interests and security was tremendous. And I think the real challenge in responding to threats from organizations like Al-Qaeda is less destroying those individuals and their organizations themselves than preventing them from attracting many more adherents, preventing their ideology from seeming attractive. So I would say, well, I would be cautious before endorsing those sorts of techniques because I think the propaganda advantages for extremists are huge. And more to the point, I mean, there is simply the moral question, are these things that we as Americans feel comfortable having done in our name?
If we're the shining city on the hill and the good guys, yeah, no, a very, very good point. We're out of time, but quickly, the fact that we buried the body at sea and did so quickly, good move in your opinion?
I think so. I mean, it clearly, well, first of all, officials made it a point to say that the body was handled in accordance with Islamic custom and tradition, which I think was appropriate and wise. But you did not want to provide even the possibility of a shrine, some sort of place of devotion and visitation around which extremists could dedicate themselves to another jihad or continuing the jihad. So it seems like a prudent move to me.
Professor Thomas, thank you for coming by and talking to us about this.
Pleasure to be with you.
Appreciate it right here on the Hank Stolz Experience.